what I was just live on right now. Let's see. Who was I just talking to? Somebody invisible. I had hit the live and started it, but I don't know what's going on. This is so odd. And I'm just like, nothing's working. Is it Mercury in retrograde already? Okay, I'm live now. Sorry, y'all. I don't know if anyone's actually watching. As I was saying before, I don't know. I don't know what just happened. This is all very odd. Okay, there's 4 people here. Hello. All right, let me turn on window comments. No comments. Cool. All right, hi guys. Sorry, my MacBook, my USB ports aren't working anymore. So I can't stream from my camera. We're a little screwed because we have interviews to do this week. So we'll have to figure it out tomorrow. But I guess when we get into this ADOS discussion, it's just going to be real low quality, and this was not my intention. I wanted to use my camera, I had everything set up, and my USB ports are just bugging out. And I'm really frustrated right now, and I don't think the Apple Store is open. All right, I'm actually going to plug in my mic, but let me try something else with my camera right quick. Because it doesn't make sense to me. My office is a mess. I have like all this book club stuff in here now. Let's see what it says when I plug in. Is my camera gonna work? Is it on? Oh, it was on that whole time and I just turned it off. Sorry about this, y'all. I really wanted to stream from my camera so this would look like a clean, normal video. And it's not working. I don't know what's going on with my camera. Like my USB ports, it's not my camera that's bugging. It's my laptop. And I just had the thought the other day, like it might be time for me to get a new laptop. I know y'all can see me, but it's on my webcam, which is lower quality, the camera built into my MacBook. And typically when I do lives, I stream from my Canon because I use a thing called CamLink, which was very expensive, that streams the HD quality through. And my USB ports on my computer are not working. It's saying when I plug in a USB device, it's saying it's taking up too much power. But I don't know how that is. Yeah. All right, let me just turn my camera off and get started because I'm going to just sit out here looking crazy. And it's very annoying. And all the interviews that I did, I used my camera so it looked nicer. And now we're just going to do it this way. Okay. So I had said I was going to do a video on ADOS. I actually like had my assistant do research for me. Oh, that's what I said I was going to do. I was going to plug in my mic so I don't sound, you don't catch the wind from my laptop because my laptop is old. It's only 5 years old. I really shouldn't need a new one right now, but if it ain't one thing, it's another. I absolutely, if I need to get a new laptop, I'm gonna hold off until. Damn, and I gotta do this thing for YouTube. On Tuesday, I am going to hold off until after Mercury in retrograde if I buy another laptop. But this is ridiculous. And the Apple Store ain't. I don't think. Well, the Apple Store near me, you can't get a Genius bar appointment. So who? Oh, guys, let's pray I don't knock the internet off by taking this out. Hear me? Oh, I'm loud. Oof. Okay, y'all can definitely hear me. I can see that. All right, so I've been talking about doing this ADOS video for a minute. It's 5 minutes in. This is ghetto. I apologize deeply that it's taking this long for me to get my act together. But I've been talking about doing this ADOS video for a while, and I can't call Ashley my assistant because I don't really pay her enough, but we've been doing research together to kind of back up what I wanted to say. And to really dig through what is actually going on with this movement that has largely found its place on YouTube. And I think people are attached to the nomenclature, which in my opinion does make sense. And not everyone who's identifying as ADOS actually knows that it's a movement that's founded by people, nor do they know the actions that the founders are taking. And the conversation tends to always go into a really aggressive, antagonistic manner whenever someone speaks out about ADOS and isn't fully just behind the movement, point blank, period. Like if anyone thinks to publicly ask questions or, be critical of the movement, it always goes left very quickly. And so I ain't never gonna do this shit publicly because they done antagonize the hell out of me. I am good on that. But I did want to come here, on Patreon. I'll let y'all hoes know while I take a bite of this fried rice what my thoughts were. Okay. So I scripted out a whole bunch of notes. Oh man, let me flip my little thing here so I can read said notes. And yeah, we're gonna just go through it because initially I was gonna do it as a pre-recorded video, but I figured I'd come in and hear some of y'all insight as well, and we could just go from there. Okay, so ADOS stands for American Descendants of Slavery. It's a term coined by Antonio Moore, known as Tone Talks on YouTube, and the movement was curated under that moniker. The movement that was curated under that moniker is led by Tone, Antonio Moore, and Yvette Carnell, who also has a fairly popular YouTube channel called Breaking Bad. Now, it's hard. I haven't really figured out specifically what ADOS is about. So, per their website, ADOS101.com, they reference the racial wealth gap and say ADOS movement is underpinned by the demand for reparative justice and making the group whole, and as a necessary component in fulfilling the promise of opportunity from which, by design, ADOS has been historically excluded and denied. Okay, so you want reparative justice in making ADOS, the community, the group, whole. It's not that that doesn't make sense, but that also doesn't address, well, how do you define reparative justice? What are the things that you believe would make the Black community whole? Yeah. Then they do show some graphs of the racial wealth gap, and they close out with a statement. ADOS sets out to shift the dialogue around the identity of what it is to be African American in an effort to move the discussion from melanin and properly center the discussion around lineage. So with that focus on, if I was going to take one thing away from it, it's okay, well, there's a focus on the lack of economic opportunity for the Black community. And from my preview, economics would also include labor opportunities. And so I know they are very much so about reparations, which is something I would absolutely align myself with. But their closing statement that says the discussion needs to center lineage, I don't believe that that's inherently wrong. But what tactics are being used, and therefore what conversation are you really trying to have? Part of my issue is, as I aforementioned, was the antagonistic approach they've taken to asserting their message over Black scholars who have long existed and participated in the fight for reparations, such as Howard professor Greg Carr. And there's like Professor Carr would consider himself a Pan-African, and I think that's where some of the antagonism comes in on ADOS's part, because a lot of the Black Americans who have been fighting for this passage of reparations, or like even pushing reparations into the mainstream conversation, are from the 60s and 70s, are going to be part of a Pan-African movement, because the Black Power movement was Pan-African. Like, civil rights was happening at the same time as the decolonization of West Africa. And a lot of the literati or the view, like Stokely Carmichael, who's from Trinidad, or, MLK traveled to, and even if you go back, because civil rights isn't just the 60s, if you go back to what is considered like the beginning of the civil rights era, which is the 1910s, so you have Du Bois, who's buried in Accra, Ghana. This whole mode of Black American liberation, of Black, and also like this reparative justice for the Black American community, as in those who have descended from slaves, has always been connected to a Pan-African movement, because slavery did not just happen in the United States. And I think what we tend to overlook was that slaves weren't just dropped off and left in one location, right? Slaves were transported throughout the Americas. So, like if I trace my lineage back, my father's mother's family traces back to what is now known as Jamaica. And oddly enough, every generation has a nigga named Bahamas. I don't know like what was happening in 1750. I don't know what the Bahamas meant in 1750, but because someone in my family was transported as a slave from Jamaica to St. Augustine, Florida, there's this connection to. Now, I wouldn't define myself as Jamaican because of that, though, but that's just highlighting that a lot of us have, because when the British abolished slavery, folks brought their slaves over to the States. When, the Civil War was happening, people transported their slaves further west and into Central and South America. And then you have the whole repatriation movement. Is that the correct term? Like, how was Liberia and Sierra Leone founded? And interestingly enough, what did those Black folks do when they got to Liberia? Liberia, it wasn't quite good. So for me, it's like taking an antagonistic approach to somebody because they are not anti-immigrant and they're not participating in the nativist part of your movement. This is not something I can get behind. It always is consistent on Twitter, and therefore the people who are identifying as ADOS are taking on this antagonistic spirit. And I get it. Twitter isn't often the place to have these critical conversations, and I don't actually think Tone and Yvette are entirely antagonistic in their videos, but I think this conversation around othering and the participation of othering Black folks just doesn't allow it. And it's this is why I took all these notes so I could be clear, because you could veer off a million and one ways with this. But the thing is, the problem with reparative justice we'll say ADOS, because I actually don't think the nomenclature is bad, and I do believe there is a need for clarifying. I want to say nomenclature again, for a clarifying term that defines the Black community that did descend from slaves who were brought to the United States of America. I do think there's many benefits to having a term that clearly defines us, that cannot be co-opted, in the same way that I can't co-opt Nigerian American. I can't co-opt Igbo. I can't co-opt Jamaican American, right? And so the same way that those terms cannot be co-opted, I do think it would benefit Black Americans that descend from slavery here in the States to have terminology that defines our ethnicity. But taking that term and then saying, I'm going to participate in anti-immigrant rhetoric, and I'm going to attack the individual and not the systems, and I'm not even going to attack the power players that uphold the systems. I'm just going to attack the people at the bottom of that system. It's not productive. And it's bigoted. And people always take issue when I bring up the term bigotry, but do y'all know the definition of bigotry? How? If you're attacking an individual who doesn't have the means to uphold the system, and saying, oh, because you're an immigrant, you're automatically this. I really don't know where else do you land with it? But first, I did want to, before we even really get into all that, I wanted to address the thing around the Russian bots, because I think this is where people have gotten in a lot of trouble. And, I did a video like in 2017 when all this data was coming out about like Russian hacking and how it was targeted at African Americans. And I made a comment about Russian bots targeting misinformation at Black Americans or at African Americans. And I didn't say anything about ADOS. I wasn't thinking about ADOS because I'm on YouTube. So I know they're real people and I know it's founded by Yvette and Tone. And the comments got taken over by people from ADOS claiming that I was calling them bots. No, there was actually a Russian campaign, and it was and it's known as the Russian 2016 influence operation to infiltrate American social media and influence the outcome of the 2016 election. This is a fact, right? And a lot of the media coverage has centered, like working class white folks, the MAGA crowd, right? But there was a lot of these reports have come out and said there was an effort targeted at African Americans. And I'll link down, after this is over, I have an article to link down that covers all this information. But the Russian influence campaign was run by a company called St. Petersburg. It was run by a company out of St. Petersburg called the Internet Research Agency, which is owned by a Russian businessman whose name I ain't even fit to try to pronounce. It's too many Y's, R's, and V's in that bitch. That ain't my ministry. But he's a close ally of Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia. So this Internet Research Agency created a dozen websites disguised as African American in origin with names like Black Matters US, Blacktivist.info, Black to Live, Black Soul. And on YouTube, the largest share of Russian material covered the Black Lives Matter movement and police brutality with channels called Don't Shoot and Black to Live. And the idea was that it was meant to push forth. And look, it is hard, right? Because these are all very valid feelings for Black folks to have, right? I can spell this word. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but nihilism, like this idea where like you don't believe in anything anymore, right? You don't believe in the positivity or the capabilities of anything anymore. So you disengage from the entire, system. You just kind of getting by every day. And I think a lot of the messaging, like the misinformation that's targeted after the Black American community, often takes on like this narrative of nobody's gonna save us, right? Nobody's gonna do good by us, and we should just leave the entire system behind and like supposedly form our own community, but where? And so the messaging within this Russian hacking thing wasn't even pro-Trump per se, but they did take on an antagonistic nativist language. And nativist means to like this idea that I am from this land and I am from here, and therefore no one else can fuck with me, essentially. Like, I'm from here, you from over there, right? We believe in borders, and there is you cannot participate in the things that I do, right? And I'm not saying all this to dismiss ADOS, but they did start initially as, I don't think it's, any movement that hasn't crossed over to the mainstream can be categorized as fringe, right? So in all fairness, you could likely say that Smart Brown Girl, I'm not trying to be a mainstream movement. I'm not trying to culturally, well, I am, but like not like that. You know what I mean? Like, I think when you have movements that take on very strong language, because Black Lives Matter gets co-opted, Abolish the Police gets co-opted, right? Like all these movements that are radical in tone and haven't necessarily crossed over into the mainstream, and therefore the people that have curated these messages aren't necessarily the most visible people discussing it. It's easy for nefarious sources to come in and co-opt that language and turn it into something it's not. And so I think that's where the ADOS movement got some people made the assumption of them being bots. I do think some of their rhetoric was co-opted by Russian hackers and used because it's easy to, and a lot of people that are actual members of ADOS will have American flags in their thing, in their bios on Twitter with like no pictures of themselves anywhere on the website. And because Yvette and Tone have curated this movement that is already antagonistic on Twitter, it's easy to fashion yourself as them, even though you're over in Russia and you're just trying to get people to disengage from the electorate. This isn't really, I do think they have to take some responsibility for the way that their antagonism can be used against them. But I also understand why people would push back when like a Joy Reid or Angela Rye gets on MSNBC and dismisses the movement wholly as bots, right? And there's a lot more nuance happening there. They're not bots. Okay, so I'm actually going to talk about what makes sense in regards to the movement for me. And I've already said the terminology ADOS, American Descendant of Slaves. I also think there was the other term, American Descendants of Chattel Slavery. I'm sorry, I have food in my mouth. I remember racist. I get the need for the language. I don't know if it still fulfills the need, right? Because then I want to get technical with you and say, well, the Caribbean is part of the Americas. So, you know, is this enough? Because the Caribbean definitely had chattel slavery. I understand some of the frustrations that are coming out of the rise of certain immigrant communities in the United States. You know, I did live in Houston, which is also known as Mini Biafra. And I have previously, which is why I think some ADOS people have tripped over to my channel, I have discussed the cultural exchange that happened, or the experiences that I had in Houston, because that was the first city that I lived in where I felt like the line was really drawn in the sand of like Nigerians are over here, Black Americans are over there, and they're like experiencing that sort of. It's interesting though, I experienced this like Nigerian elitism, which I really think is like, it's like, you know, everyone wants to like, people want to talk about this. No immigrants, right? But a lot of times their messaging really comes down to the dominance economically of Nigerians in America. And again, this is a complicated conversation to have. There is a conversation to be had about America's an imperialistic capitalistic society. Every structure they create is going to replicate those capitalistic imperialistic efforts, right? So immigration, you know, the Department of Homeland Security, what department does that go through under the federal government? Whatever department under the federal government immigration goes through is absolutely going to replicate the imperialistic capitalistic interests, especially when it comes to allowing what is essentially more niggas into this country. But to say it more politely, if this country was always built on the idea of seeing Black bodies as the modes of production, right? And that the white people owned the modes of production, and they've always seen Black folks as property and as labor, whether it is as enslaved people, whether it is through Jim Crow, whether it is through mass incarceration. We consistently have these replications of Black bodies being seen as property in American society. And so when you allow more Black folks into this country, you are absolutely going to create a hierarchy that says if you legally come into this country, you are going to serve the same benefits. And so what we have is even the refugee system in this country creates a hierarchy of privilege, right? Actually I have a poster up here, More Than a Refugee. I did a project with the IRC, with the International Refugee Committee. They flew me to Boise, Idaho, because when you, like, I'm not going to get into the whole semantics of what it means to be a refugee in this country, but typically you come out of a refugee camp, very few people make it out. There is a hierarchy of respectability because, again, this is the United States of capitalism and imperialism. And you get on a plane, they don't tell you where you're going. You don't get to pick where you're going. So depending on what time your flight leaves, you might end up in Norway. You might end up in the States. And typically they put you in like small town middle America, right? This is specific to the refugee, right? Because people that immigrate here in the immigrant status, right, through the legal immigration system, they're way above on the hierarchy. They're above the refugee status. But I'm going to go below that and say, okay, well, even refugee system here replicates a system of a hierarchy of privilege. I went to Boise, Idaho, because for people that come out of, so they're mostly, so the Democratic Republic of Congo has been on an ongoing war, mostly because there are a lot of valuable minerals that aid in the production of tech products. So there has been an ongoing forever war in the DRC, and a lot of people get placed in, if you end up in Uganda, bless your heart. But and this goes into the whole refugee industrial complex. People make a lot of money off of this stuff. So creating strife and then creating these refugee camps is an actual profitable industry, right? And so there's this hierarchy. If you end up in Uganda, you're like down here. You end up in Rwanda, it's a little bit better. You end up in Kenya, depending on where in Kenya you end up, it's at the top, right? And so I went to Boise and met with Congolese refugees, and there was a very, very, very clear distinction. First of all, when I got to the refugee office, above all the Africans is the Syrians, all right? And it was so obvious, right? You walk in and they get treated differently. The means to even have, and I'm veering off into a whole nother video topic, but I can't stress enough that there is a very clear hierarchy in all of these systems. And then when I went to the apartment complex where a lot of the Congolese people live, you could literally visibly see the folks that come from Uganda because they are malnourished, they typically they live in a male-dominated household. They're not able to get the same sort of jobs. The folks from Kenya are not even living in apartment complexes. They got houses and businesses. And then the Rwandans are somewhere in between, right? So if you think that at that level, there's this hierarchy existing, then when you get into immigration where you have to have money, it is not cheap. You need to know someone who can pull you into the system. You are automatically going to pull out, like, the easiest way to explain this, there's a reason why Nigerian Americans are the highest GDP of black folks in America. And you got niggas like Michael and Osman, fucking ugly ass poor white women from Georgia on 90 Day Fiance. Everyone doesn't get to even get a visa to visit. Right? So this system is going to constantly replicate, and this is actually a conversation for the immigrant community to have itself, right? I tweeted something about the fact that Yvonne Orji's, I felt like her comedy special veered a little bit on elitism. And this is a conversation that's going to be had to have by these communities about this sort of, yeah, I can, if you have the means to immigrate to America through the legal process, you have to just acknowledge that you have privilege. That doesn't mean that your life is easy. That doesn't mean that the immigration process is easy. It's horrible. It's extremely difficult. And it squeezes very few people through. And so I think there's this frustration happening about the way certain Black communities have become visible in this country. And the frustration shouldn't be targeted at the people because there's this system that's replicating this hierarchy, that's replicating these capitalistic and imperialistic interests. And that system needs to be changed, not the individuals that typically get access, that get squeezed through this system. And I just think a lot of their rhetoric is actually targeted at a frustration towards Nigerian Americans, and that's it's just like, what's productive about that? How does this move the needle forward? And if we're really going to talk about reparations, how does beefing with like a Cynthia Erivo or a Yvonne Orji further this conversation about reparations? Why do they become the representation of what could be a legitimate frustration, and why aren't we digging at the systems that have replicated this racism, this lack of access for the larger Black community? And I think the work is there, though. It's not like it has to be dug up. And like everyone's talking about this police abolition, right? Abolishing the police. The work is the research the synthesizing of the theory is already there. And a lot of it is connected. And if you watch my Josie Duffy Rice interview, which the final version of it will go up this week, we talk about there's all these systems that are connected to the ways in which American society has continually found a way to keep Black folks in a realm of where other people own their labor. And there's this entire web of systems that you can pull out: the lack of access to education, the economics. And it's not that this is really the point, because I think I'm going way all over the place, because this is always, every time I talk about ADOS, it's like, ooh, all these things, right? I think the messaging that there are other Black people that are taking up our space does not serve the Black community, because you're not fighting to broaden the space, you're fighting to keep the space small. We have to understand the mechanics of what gets society to look the way it looks, right? Nigeria in particular is what, the 6th or 7th most populous country in the world. Like, that's a lot of niggas. And regardless of education, they are culturally a society that still likes to have big families, which runs against the way a lot of other societies work, right? Typically, the more education people have, the less children they have. Olu and Tola still having 6 kids with dual degrees. And it creates a larger society. And so you just have a bigger community. It's going to seem like they're more represented. That's not the right language, right? But the idea is, if there's more of them, it's easier to feel like it's all these things happening specifically with them. And it's really just a numbers game. It's just a lot of them. That's really all that is. It's a lot of them, and they culturally, regardless of where they're located, they still have a lot of kids. And so it can feel like there's more of this or that happening. And I will say, in the spectrum of like college education, I think one of the examples that we can actually pull of like how this conversation about this frustration about the spaces in which Black folks are allowed, and how little room, even within that little room, how little room Black Americans get. I think a good representation of how that conversation can go in a productive manner is when the Cornell BSU Student Association put out a letter to Cornell to address the lack of services or the lack of commitment that Cornell had to the community that it inhabited and towards diversity, and that they were just stuffing the affirmative action pipeline with white women and immigrant students, and not actually going back to the Ithaca community. Isn't Cornell in Ithaca? To the Ithaca community that they are a part of, that the land they co-opt, that they exist on, and working with creating a pipeline for students from high school to college, or from secondary education to college. Isn't college secondary education? Y'all know what I'm trying to say, okay? That part. I thought it was productive because it doesn't say that these students who are currently here shouldn't exist here. But it does say that everyone who comes through off the backs of the work that Black Americans and the sacrifice Black Americans have taken should have a commitment to turning back around to the Black American community and lifting us up. And it's on the onus of Cornell to change a system that's plucking individuals out of communities, but not doing anything to actually service the community. And the problem with focusing it on saying, okay, well, if we say in theory, no more immigrants allowed through affirmative action, right? You can't count immigrants as like your Black student population. The numbers are still low. There's still not a lot of space. You could kick out Cynthia Erivo, kick out Yvonne and that whole Voltron crew that seems to always be a lightning rod for this conversation, right? That's like 6 niggas. How many more spaces we got for us? Because we're not attacking the systems. We're not attacking the modes of operation that actually get us to this point, right? We're not going after the power structure that dominates us. And it doesn't, like, the the way in which the immigration structure needs to be changed, I don't really even think is like a concern, or shouldn't be a concern of the ADOS movement. Like, if you're really going to participate in this idea that we should exist that we should get our own recognition, right? That if we don't have the means to celebrate ourselves or keep any part of our culture sacred, because the white majority will always see anybody who's black as black, right? So you get folks, I get it, right? You do a scholarship, you do an award ceremony, like, and there's deeper things to this, right? But let's keep it surface level so it's easier to digest, right? If you do a award ceremony or a scholarship offering and you say it's for black folks, right? Like, I just did something in DC with the Sadie Tanner. I'm a Delta, so I always have to say Sadie Tanner, Marcel Alexander. But the Sadie Alexander, she was one of the first black women to get her PhD at University of Pennsylvania. And these young black girls put together a Sadie Alexander scholarship program for black women in STEM. It was all but one of them was Africans. All but one of the women, I ain't got no issue with that, right? But I do get okay, well, can I then, everyone's favorite person to shout out, Yvonne Orji did a Nigerian American night for Nigerians in Hollywood. Am I allowed to be acknowledged in that night? Am I allowed to win an award in the same way that you can get an award at the Essence Black Women in Hollywood dinner? There's not this ability to, the cross-cultural exchange isn't necessarily unilateral, because again, everything in America is going to replicate imperialistic capitalistic interests. So there's always this sort of hierarchy, even beyond, like, if you do a Caribbean Student Association, not association, but if you do like a Caribbean Student Award, I don't qualify for that. But if we do a Black Student Award, or even if we say Black American Student Award, by all means, every Black person in this country would qualify for that, qualify to be considered for that, right? And so we don't have a way to say, all right, we're actually, like, if we don't have the language to define our group, then how do we, and language is very useful, then how do we define ourselves? And how do we keep parts of our culture sacred? And how do we really get white folks and the power players and the power players, the power structures, to acknowledge and focus on us? I do think there's a usefulness in language, in creating language to define our ethnicity, but I just absolutely don't see any usefulness in attacking immigrants. You can't convince me of the usefulness of that. We can absolutely have a conversation about elitism. We can have a conversation about classism. We can have a conversation about the hierarchy that the immigration system creates. And it's like, if Black folks, if African Americans were ever to en masse migrate to another country, everyone would not get to leave, right? You have a decent sized migrant community of Black Americans in France. And it's largely, like, every report about it is that it's the upper echelons of Black American society who get to migrate or immigrate to France. Even when I was in Ghana, it's a little bit different, because niggas think, I'm going to go to a Black ass country and I'm going to scam. So there's some folks struggling in Ghana that's Black American because they thought. But the vast majority of Black Americans in Ghana are upper middle class. You could look at the entire history of, like, what happened with the Black Americans who repatriated to Liberia. Like, it's the same thing that happened, you know what I mean? Like, they created a whole upper class in Liberia till Samuel Doe came around and started slitting niggas' throats. And said, you know what I mean? Like, come on, it happens time, like, this, we have so much history that informs us of how unuseful it is to other, in a belittling way, Black folks of the diaspora, because you want to exalt yourself over them, and you're still feeding into the implications of a white supremacist society. It don't work like that. It ain't never gonna work like that. It ain't never gonna work like that. And so I don't know how, if I've been clear, if I'm making sense. I don't know if y'all have any questions. I feel like I done talked about so many things. Oh, the last thing, Sandy Darty. Okay, Sandy Darty is an economics professor from Duke University. I will say this. With the nativist, anti-immigrant approach, that Tone, and particularly Yvette has really been the one that's been on this anti-immigrant kick. I think it is intellectually unethical of Sandy Darty to align his work with ADOS without at all publicly curtailing or criticizing or letting them know that this anti-immigrant approach is the wrong way to take his research, right? He's talked a lot about the economics of the Black community and that essentially what we need is, we need dollars. We absolutely, pay Black folk. Pay the niggas, okay? We need like a couple billion. And I will say, this is nothing I appreciate about ADOS. They have consistently said slavery and Jim Crow. I think, Jim Crow in the mainstream conversation, I don't know if we realize what Jim Crow really was. All the systems that are still in place today that came out of Jim Crow, and how much of our understanding, like Black traditionalism, which came out of like the survival mode that Black folks were in Jim Crow, but like has been very harmful, particularly like Black women, Black queer folk, non-binary, Black differently abled people. How harmful that sort of, and just Black poor people in general, how harmful that sort of messaging is to still hold on to it in the 21st century. But I do appreciate that they acknowledge that, Jim Crow was like a second layer of compounding of, I want to say dismembering the Black community, but like this really, I am losing all my words right now. But like slavery was a huge apparatus, right? That very much so harmed the African diaspora. I absolutely believe that we've all felt the heat, which is why I don't participate. I know it's like, I think the problem is when I start talking about ADOS and how I don't agree with the anti-immigrant stance that they take, and I think it's bigoted, that the response is that I think that, oh, are you going to feed into that immigrants are better than us? No, I think that is bigoted messaging, right? Like that neither of these attacking each other, right? You can have a cultural pride without valuing your culture over mine, right? Like my pride in my culture is irregardless of the other cultures that exist. It's a pride that I have because of the culture that I firmly know I exist from. It doesn't have to rely on me stepping on the backs of another culture to define my value. But I think both of those sorts of messaging are bigoted messaging, and it should be dispensed of. But with regards to Sandy Darty, I think the work he's done makes a lot of sense. But even he doesn't, it's like, okay, well, who do you define as ADOS then, right? Because a lot of folks, there's been this cross-cultural exchange. And if we want to say that your entire lineage has to come from people that were enslaved in the United States of America, I mean, most of the Louisiana boot wouldn't make it. So how you gonna do this? And I think he said someone who has at least one or two Black grandparents. Man, I had it in here. Let me pull up my notes. If I can pull it up on here. I might just have to pull it up on my laptop. Let me do this because it might be easier for me to find it. Dag. One pager. Let's just go to Drive. Dag. Bail system in the United States. Oh, I had somebody create a whole document for me. I'm trying to find because I had pulled up all these links for the ADOS thing. This is not the right file. I hope I'm making sense. I feel like I'm all over the place, which is why I wanted to like script this out. But to be honest, like I got so many. I'm gonna be up late tonight working because I have so much stuff to get done. Let me find my doc with all the details on it. Because she put in... Oh, is it not here? Damn it. Where is it? Which email? I have like 5 different emails. Oh, here it goes. ADOS. Okay, close. Let's see. Sandy. Yeah, Yvette was part of Progressives for Immigration Reform. Ann Coulter tweeted she likes ADOS. But she thought it should be DOAS, Descendants of American Slaves, not Haitian slaves, not Moroccan slaves. Whew, okay, sis. Okay. Where is all the notes? Dad, because she put all this stuff in notes, and so now I can't. Okay, who gets reparations? An individual must have at least one ancestor, one, who was enslaved in the United States of America. That is a lot of people. For at least 12 years before the enactment of reparations program, an individual would have had to self-identify as Black, Negro, or African American. Okay. Now, if you voluntarily migrate to a racist society, are you eligible for compensation for the racism that exists in that society? That's the rhetorical question that Darty would like to pose. If you voluntarily migrate to a racist society, are you eligible for compensation for the racism that exists in that society? Non-descendants of folks enslaved in the United States were less than 1% of the Black population in the United States up until the mid-1960s. Oh, he was talking about the explosion within. Migrants. Okay. Another thing in my notes that is standing out that I wanted to touch on. I actually Darty's definition of who should get reparations doesn't bother me, but I do still think like plenty of people who are part of the immigrant community would still qualify. For instance, I have a few friends who are like Mario Liberian, right? Their families were enslaved in America. They wholly identify as West African now. They would qualify. They've been in the States. They've identified as Black. And they're a privileged class because they got to go and plunder another land, make themselves the upper class, and then come back and re-migrate to the States. And so they're going to have certain economic advantages that my family's never had a part of, right? And they would still qualify. And so I just think this idea that it's futile to try to push all the immigrants out because you have to, on top of it, like even by their own admonition, all immigrants don't count, right? They've said that there are outliers. Marcus Garvey, who's from what is now known as Jamaica, as I mentioned, Stokely Carmichael, Harry Belafonte, all these folks who have, because there has been a cross-cultural exchange between the Caribbeans. And like what we don't also consider, migrant workers. Like I think we often think of migrant workers as Mexicans, but my brothers, like I'm in North Carolina, my dad's first wife, right? Part of her family's from Grenada that used to come to Florida to pick oranges and would migrate up the East Coast for harvest season. I know quite a few, like and it's not that there's a cohesive community, but you just start talking to folks from the Carolinas and plenty of them have family or family members who have migrated from someplace from Central America or the Caribbean because of work and just got absorbed into the Black community. And so you trying to kick everyone out, and it's like, to the white folk, we all niggas. It's just like, okay, what are we doing here? Another thing is I think they have spoken out against the association with Tariq Nasheed, but for the ability for Tariq to so easily find himself adjacent to them, when your messaging is that easily aligned with someone who is very misogynistic, who is very homophobic, and with ease he gets wrapped up in this movement, even though they ended up having a little fallout with Nasheed. It's like the association that it was that easy for them to find themselves here. And I don't know if enough of the people that are tagging themselves as ADOS know that Yvette and Carnell don't have vocally said they don't mess with Nasheed. Because a lot of, especially when and this is, I don't know, and then as soon as you say, well, maybe it is bots, then people are like, oh no, ADOS isn't bots. Oh, well, maybe these people are, because Tariq Nasheed definitely uses bots to attack folks that he goes after. If you ever end up on his, like, he tweets at you, you'll get a bunch of, like, accounts that will, and because I have had Nasheed mention me and come after me, you'll get a bunch of tweets from accounts that say the same thing over and over again, like the same exact tweet in your mentions. It's really weird. And then you click on the accounts and, like, they're not real. They're not real. And so you're like, what is happening here? What is going on here? But I don't know if there's any questions. I'm gonna look at the comments. There's not that really many people on here, but you know, if folks have questions later, I'm not really gonna type them out. I'm sorry this video is so low quality. I really wanted it to be, at least, you know, me not be so dark. I could turn on my lamp. It's not dark out here, but it's dark outside. Maybe that'll help a little bit. Because I'm like, oh, you can't see a bitch. But, all right. Alana is saying, expats. Well, yeah, I think that's just people in general. I want to, you know, very firmly acknowledge, I understand the desire, and I did a whole video that African American culture is not sacred. There is a certain amount, like, we don't really have the means to say, you can't participate in this function of my culture without me, right? Like, I can't put on I can't even say the word correctly, a jele. I would have to go to a member of the community in order to even, like, put on, like, a headdress, right? So there's ways in which other people can say, oh, well, like, we have naming ceremonies and we do these things, they're sacred to our culture, and even though we are both Black, you can't do that. That's not your culture. And you very much so can't do that without someone from my community, you know, bringing you into that fold. We as African Americans don't have that same means. And I don't think it's, I don't frame it as a desire to be able to pitch up a tent pole and say, oh, you other niggas gotta stay out. But I do think it's, well, how do we acknowledge our culture? How do we create a community around the culture? And how do we ensure that we are getting the services that were supposedly put out for us? And then once we realize how little them services are, like, just fight for the widen that space in general. Because the little bit of scholarship that Black folk get ain't nearly enough even just for ADOS folk. Right? The problem is that, like, I was just watching this new Vice thing on Black South Rising. Is that what it was called? I just watched it with Alzo. I know Alzo in real life. He fine, but something wrong with him because he's been single too long. And his brother married a Mexican, but let me leave. Mo is actually my friend, so I should not be shading him. But they were highlighting what's been going on in Charlotte with the school system, right? And how when they undid the busing laws that were busing students from one side of town to the other to desegregate schools, you saw West Charlotte schools, which is where we have really bad redlining here in Charlotte, right? So this thing called the Wedge and the Crescent. And even if you look at, like, a congressional map, so, like, Jeff Jackson, who I interviewed, and the draft of the interviews up on my YouTube, on my Patreon. Jeff Jackson's district, which is Mecklenburg 27, is, like, cut out, like, it, because I live right on the corner of where the Wedge starts. Like, the Wedge literally starts behind my house, my apartment, And it's the wealthiest neighborhoods in Charlotte where the highest concentration of white folks live. And then all the black people kind of live all spread out. So there's not really a cohesive black community, even though West Charlotte is very much so black. And there's a distinct difference. Like, all the neighborhoods around the wedge, which my neighborhood is included, all the bars, restaurants, grocery stores, like I can walk to the library, I can walk to the bank, to the post office. I have everything when walking distance in my neighborhood. You get to West Charlotte, you lucky if you have a Food Lion and a Chinese restaurant next door that the food ain't good. And it's wild how little infrastructure that they purposefully, it's a purposeful thing, right? That there's so little infrastructure in these neighborhoods. I forgot the point I was even fucking making that connected to all of this. But yeah, like what would you do? Would you come here and say, all right, none of the immigrants get to take part in affirmative action, but then what are you left with? Because it wasn't like the immigrants coming in was the reason why you didn't see affirmative action in the first place. It's because they purposely kept your ass out regardless of what other black folks was here. And so there's still a systematic change that has to happen. So why are we wasting our energy against individuals and not breaking down the systems? Like, why are we attempting to uphold the systems just so we as individuals can get our piece in and not actually break down the systems that's keeping the community out? That's where I'm at. All right. I hope everyone has a good night. You can leave here with questions. It's ended up being an hour anyway because I like talking to myself. And I'll holler at y'all later. Bye.